Kate, it's water for you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I've wanted to come to this conference for many years now and never managed, so it's great to come at last. Didn't expect to finally come as a speaker, so very grateful to be invited and to come and talk to you a little bit about the work of Mary's Meals. I think Mary's Meals is another sign to the world of God's mercy. Mary's Meals to me is more than anything a gift, a very unexpected gift from God. I know sometimes when I'm invited to give talks like this and I'm introduced, I'm described as the founder of Mary's Meals, and I suppose in one sense I am, but in many ways it doesn't feel like that at all to me, because there was never any point where I or anyone else said, let's start a new aid organization, or let's do this or let's do that. It's something that happened very unexpectedly in our lives. And I would like to just share that a little bit with you this morning. But maybe before I do that, maybe just first of all to just explain a little bit about what Mary's Meals is today. As Dawn says, we're feeding children in many different countries around the world, 15 of the world's poorest countries. And on every school day now, we feed over 1.2 million children every day. And we always feed those children in places of education. It is amazing. We always feed those children in places of education. We serve one meal every day in school for the hungry child, so that we meet their immediate need for food. But at the same time, we help tackle the underlying cause of poverty by always serving that meal in a way that enables children to come to school and to gain that education that can set them free. And wherever we do this work, it's owned by the local community. Tens of thousands of people who are living in poverty themselves, giving up their time every day to cook and serve the meals for the hungry children in their community. It's a very wonderful thing to see all those little acts of love. And that's really how I think about Mary's Meals around the world today. Just like a series of lots and lots of little acts of love, because that's how all this work is possible. All over the world, people are supporting this work in many different ways. Lots of you here. I see many Mary's Meals t-shirts here today, and I know so many of you here are involved in this mission in so many different ways, volunteering your time, making donations, and praying for this work. And I can't thank all of you enough who are already involved in making this mission possible. And maybe a special thanks for those of you who pray for this work, because definitely I would describe Mary's Meals as a fruit of prayer. And maybe the story I tell you this morning of how it began might just give you an idea of why I believe that so firmly. So the story, I think, of Mary's Meals really began when I was only 15 years of age. I grew up in a small village in Argyll in Scotland, really in the middle of nowhere, 400 people in our village. I still live there today. It's called Dalmally. And when I was 15 years of age, one normal morning in our house at the breakfast table, my sister, the oldest of our family, said at the breakfast table, look, there's an article here in the newspaper that says that some teenagers in Yugoslavia, as it was then, are having apparitions of the Virgin Mary in a place called Medjugorje. And we started saying to our mum and dad, if that's even possibly true, that Our Lady could be appearing today, surely we should go there and find out if it's true. And much to our surprise, Mum and Dad said, well, we're kind of busy at the moment. If you want to go, you can. That would be fine. And so a few weeks after that conversation, about 10 of us went over to Medjugorje. We were all teenagers. I was the youngest at 15. It was mainly my brothers and sister and cousins, and the oldest was Ruth at 19. And we went over there and we spent a week there. This was long before it was 1983, long before there were any hotels or restaurants or anything like that in Medjugorje. It was a very small, sleepy village. And I'm not here to talk about Medjugorje this morning, but just to say the week there really changed our lives. And when we went back home to Scotland, our parents could see that something had changed quite dramatically. Before that, they would always be chasing us to say our prayers, and we came back saying, you know, Mum and Dad, we need to pray more. We need to make sure we say our rosary in the evenings. We should be fasting. And as you can imagine, Mum and Dad were pretty amazed by these teenagers suddenly coming home like that. And they were so moved by that they went to Medjugorje themselves a couple of months later and had a similar experience. And when they came home, they felt that God was asking them to turn our home, which was a guest house, a small hotel, to turn that home into a Catholic retreat centre. It's called Craig Lodge Family House of Prayer. I know some of you here have spent time there. And really in the early days, that was simply about my parents opening the doors of our home and inviting people who wanted to come and spend time with the Lord, spend time in prayer to do that. And people started coming from all over, and then it became more organized. They began to organize formal retreat programs at weekends with different priests and speakers coming in to lead those retreats on different themes. And then over the years, a little community of people grew there. That there was a part of that community was about enabling young people to come and live for 1 year at a time there, to live a year of prayer, a year of learning more about their faith, and a year of service, serving those people who were coming to stay in the retreat centre. And then some families began to move to the village as well, families who wanted to live beside Craig Lodge and to support each other in trying to live the gospel. So that's where I grew up. That's the background. And by the way, I don't want to tell that story like I grew up as some kind of saintly figure. It wasn't like that at all. And certainly in my late teens and early 20s, while I never lost my faith, I suppose thinking back on it now, I began to live two different lives. You know, one life I was still saying my rosary every day and going to mass, and another life was mainly in the pub, drinking, and with a group of friends who I would never ever speak to about my faith. Two kind of parallel lives, and looking back on it now, I had no peace because of that. God, I think, wanted all of me, not just a bit of me. So anyway, during those years, 1992, November, one dark, rainy evening in our village, my brother and I were down in our local pub having a pint of beer, and this particular evening we both began talking to each other about this thing we'd seen on the television that evening. It had been a news report about the war in Bosnia. By this time, the war in the former Yugoslavia was at its height. And this news bulletin was about how refugees were suffering terribly there. And it happened to be about a refugee camp that was very close to Medjugorje. And I think because of that, Fergus, my brother, and I began saying to each other, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just do even one small thing to help those people who showed us such kindness all those years ago? And before even really thinking about it very seriously in the days after that, or forming any kind of proper plan, we just started asking people we knew, would they give us maybe some food and clothing and medical items. And we knew of this group from London who were driving aid out there. So about 3 weeks after that conversation in the pub, we found ourselves driving this old Land Rover out of Dalmally across Europe into this refugee camp near Medjugorje, and delivering all these beautiful gifts that people had given us in Scotland. And I always say that was really the first dramatic miracle in the story. It was the first time that Fergus and I ever hatched a plan in a pub that actually happened. So that was amazing enough. But I came back from that week in Bosnia thinking that I would just be back to work as normal. I was a fish farmer, a salmon farmer, in a very, very remote place off the coast of Scotland. And I just came home thinking I'll be back to work, and I got back to discover that God had a completely different plan. Because when I got home, I came home to discover this mountain of food and clothing, and people turning up at our home every day with carloads of more gifts. And so I prayed about it and thought about it and decided to give up my job, and which wasn't a massive sacrifice, by the way, for any of you who've ever worked on the sea off the west coast of Scotland in the winter. So I gave up my job, and I sold my house, and somebody gave me a small truck. And I just said to God, I'll keep driving the aid there as long as people keep giving, and as long as there's a need. And I suppose I thought maybe I'll do this for a few months. I might even do it for a year, and then it'll be back to work as normal. And I suppose the reason that here we are 25 years later, and I'm still doing this work, and it's grown in this incredible way around the world. I think the reason for that really is in that first story I told you of making a small plea on behalf of people who are suffering and just being overwhelmed by people's goodness, by people's acts of mercy. That's been our story ever since. Here in Ireland and in so many places around the world, this work just grows and grows because of those little acts of love. So I never did go back to work on the salmon farm, and in those coming months and years, I just drove almost continuously back and forth from Scotland to different parts of Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia, and back home in Scotland. This amazing group of volunteers and friends began organising all the aid that was coming in, ready for delivery to Bosnia. And those years of driving aid back and forth to Bosnia taught me so many things, especially about God's mercy, just through the witness of others. But it taught me lots of other things as well. I didn't really have a clue what I was doing. I didn't even really know how to drive a truck properly. I was a very bad truck driver. And I suppose one of the things, reflecting on it now, is I realize that whatever we needed for this work, God always provided in His mercy. So He provided in a very spectacular way in terms of me not being able to drive very well. So I met my wife through doing this work. She was a nurse from Inverness. I didn't know her then. She phoned me out of the blue to say, I feel God's asked me to go and help the people in Bosnia as a nurse. Could you take me there and introduce me to the people in the hospitals? And so she persuaded me that she could come out in one of the deliveries, and I was going there with a priest friend of mine, and she joined us, and out we went. And we drove into the city of Mostar, which was under siege at that time, and it was being bombed every morning. And we had to go in very early, and we were just arriving after this 4-day journey outside the hospital, and there was a group of nurses and doctors outside the hospital waving, well, I thought they were waving their welcome as we arrived with all these medicines that they were desperately needing. And I have to admit, I was thinking to myself, I hope this very beautiful young nurse in the lorry is quite impressed by this welcome we're getting. And then at the very last minute, I realised that they weren't waving a welcome at all. They were saying, "Stop," because I misjudged the height of the canopy outside the hospital, and I drove straight into it, as if they didn't have enough trouble already in that hospital. So anyway, Julie became our co-driver, one of the drivers as this work grew. And it turned out very quickly that she was a much better driver than I am. We had to go and sit our tests to drive the big articulated trucks. And of course, she passed first time and I failed. But I think it was a grounding for a very happy marriage. We're married today with 7 children. And she hardly ever reminds me about those driving lessons. Thank you very much. So God is good. And then I began to learn lots of other things, not just about how bad I was at driving, especially about learning from people who have nothing, people in those refugee camps who had lost absolutely everything in the war. And learning very often that some of those people that we were serving were people who were much better educated than me, people who'd been in very responsible jobs, people who'd owned businesses before the war, who at that moment in time had nothing and who were completely dependent on our help. And it was a real privilege to make friends with some of those people. Some of those friendships endure to this day, and it was a real lesson to me about when we get involved in works like this, works of mercy, works of charity, that we should never ever do this in a way when we happen to be the giver, that we think we are somehow, because of that, superior to the person in need that we give to. That's been a really, really important part of our work to this day, that when we serve people, we serve them in a spirit of respect. We respect their dignity, that they are co-workers with us. So began to learn many things like that, and to learn from wonderful people in Croatia and Bosnia at that time who were carrying out extraordinary acts of mercy, who were organizing aid for people in even greater difficulty, still stuck in the heart of the war in Bosnia. Learned from other people too. Those days I used to persuade different members of my family to come and be my co-driver on different trips, my brothers, my brother-in-law, and one time my father. And this time that my father came out with me as a co-driver, we were delivering aid to a home for children with special needs. And we got to this particular village, and again at that particular point in time the war, the front line was very close to this little home, and when we went in and met the nurses and the carers there, they were in a terrible state of fear and panic, because many of the children couldn't walk. They were all in cots, and they were terrified as the war came closer that if they had to flee, how were they going to take the children with them. And they said to us, "We need to unload your medical aid as quickly as possible out of the truck. You should go from here quickly." So we began unloading the truck into the courtyard, and I was scared because there were bombs going off nearby. And we unloaded the aid as quickly as possible, and I jumped into the driver's seat and turned on the engine ready to go. And my dad didn't appear in the passenger seat, and I looked in the rear view mirror, and I could see my dad giving these nurses big hugs. And if any of you, I think some of you do know my dad, you're probably not surprised to hear he was giving people big hugs. He likes to hug people. And I was getting very nervous, and he took a long time hugging all these nurses, and he finally climbed back in the cab, and off we went. And many years later, when not long after Pope Francis became Pope, I remember he used this term I'd never heard before. He warned us against the sin of efficiency. And when he talked about this sin of efficiency, I think he was talking mainly to people like us who are involved in works of charity. And what he was really saying was, don't get so caught up in trying to be efficient and well organized and planning that you forget to love the person in front of you, that you don't give time to really love the person in front of you. And when he spoke those words, I remembered my father from all those years before, you know, and I reflected on that, and I thought, you know, at that time I thought the most important thing was getting those boxes off the truck and the medicine into the hospital, and that was important. But probably more important was the hug that my dad gave those nurses and the words that he spoke to them that day. And again, that's to this day, even when this work's growing in this incredible way around the world, when so many hundreds of thousands of people are involved, we try to keep the work like that at its center. This is a work of love between people. It's not about big strategies and plans and numbers. It's a work of love. And if we ever lose that, this work becomes meaningless. And so the work went on, and the other people I began to learn a huge amount from were the people, like many of you here, who were giving in extraordinary ways, in just incredibly generous ways. There was this woman called Mrs. Duncan Jones, lived in a village near us in Scotland, and she lived in this little cottage at the end of a farm track. It was like a little cottage you might read about in a fairy tale, beautiful place, and she kept on collecting things for us to take to Bosnia. And I used to love going to visit her, because every time I did, she would always give me this lovely bowl of soup after we'd loaded the van with the gifts, and a fruit cake that always had an incredible amount of brandy in it. And she used to say to me, you'll need that on your trip to Bosnia. So we became good friends. And when I first knew her, her husband was an Episcopalian minister, and he died, and then she carried on collecting these goods in her area and giving them to me. And anyway, on this occasion, I turned up again, and we loaded the truck as usual, and she gave me the cake, which I put carefully in the truck, and then we sat down for a bowl of soup. And I noticed when she was serving me the soup this day, she, instead of pouring it out with a ladle, she poured it out with a mug, the soup into the bowl, and I thought that's a little strange. And I began looking around her kitchen, and I noticed there was nothing there. The cupboards were bare. There was just nothing in the kitchen. And I said, Mrs. Duncan Jones, are you leaving? Are you moving somewhere? And she said, no, it's just what, I began thinking about it, and I thought, you know, what does an old lady like me need extra cups and saucers and pots and pans for when there's all these families in Bosnia that have nothing, you know? And the thing that struck me most about Mrs. Duncan Jones when she told me about that and was her joy. You know, she's one of the most joyful people I ever met. And she was giving everything away, you know, and she just taught me so much about giving. And that's something I see in Mary's Meals. Wherever I go, in lots of different parts of the world, giving talks like this, or meeting the groups that support us, or seeing the work where the children are fed the meals every day. One of the consistent things in all those places is joy. That people who really give of themselves, people who give until it hurts, maybe in one sense, the way Mother Teresa talked about it, they're always people of joy. They're people of peace. Because I think when we do this work, when we share what we have, we become more fully human. We become more the people that God meant us to be. And certainly Mrs. Duncan Jones was a very fine example of that. And so the work went on, and people like her encouraged me so much to keep going with this work. And we began working in other countries. The next country we began working in was Romania. And we began taking truckloads of aid to hospitals in Romania also. And in this particular hospital there in Transylvania, almost by accident, we discovered 50 children who were all HIV positive and who'd all been abandoned in this dark room in the hospital. And I'll never forget walking into that particular room, and first of all, just the silence. I've never walked into a room full of children before and been met by complete silence. And that's explained by the fact that if you leave children long enough without ever picking them up, they eventually give up crying. There were children there who were 11, 12 years old that couldn't walk simply because nobody had ever lifted them out of their cots for long enough. And so over the next few weeks and months, we began taking lots of truckloads of help. But during that time, many of the children were dying in this horrible place, in this place where they were just completely neglected. And we were working there with these amazing local Romanian volunteers, people of great love, people who were demonstrating God's mercy in that dark place. And with those new friends, I began to talk to them about this dream of, can we take these children out of this place? We realized that the gifts, the goods that we were bringing weren't really changing their lives. We knew that what those children needed was someone to pick them up and to hug them and to love them. And so we hatched this dream, and a long story that I don't have time to tell today, but we eventually built the first home for those children. We called it Iona House, after the island of Iona near my home, where St. Columba came to bring us the faith all those centuries ago. Just one of the things we need to thank Ireland for is St. Columba. And we took the first 10 children out. And when we did that, we thought we were really opening hospices, places where these children at least might have a dignified, happy, short life. But we presumed that they would all die soon. And so we took the first 10 out, and then eventually we went on and built the second and third home, and we took all of the children who were still alive out of that horrible place. And during the course of that work, one of the things that struck me in a horrible way was the fact that many of the nurses and doctors in that hospital, they could just see no worth in those children at all. And they thought we were crazy. They just couldn't understand why we were doing this work. I remember when we were building the third home, I was talking to one of the doctors one day, and he pointed at this little girl called Juliana, who I'd got to know by then, and she was very sick, she was very disturbed, she was banging her head off the side of her cot, and she was covered in blood. And he pointed at this little girl and he said to me, I don't know why you're bothering with that home of yours. That little girl there, she will have died before you finish building that home. So anyway, I went back home to Scotland, and about 3 months later, I returned for the official opening of that third home. And I always remember being met at the front door of the new home by Juliana, who was holding the hand of our carer. She was learning to walk by then. And that was just such a special day. But in the years since then, that story has just become more and more beautiful. So many miracles God has worked in that place in Romania. Most of those children we took out are still alive. Juliana died last year after many years of happiness with us. I've been back for the weddings of 3 of the girls we took out of that hospital. They all have healthy children of their own now. And yeah, for me it's just such a beautiful experience of God's mercy, God's love, how he can transform even situations that seem hopeless, and I was thinking about that actually in terms of some of the struggles that you face here in Ireland, some of the battles that you face today, and that experience in Romania of children that people thought were worth nothing, that didn't have any rights, and how God took that situation, and in his love he transformed it. So God is good. And then the work just continued and grew in so many ways around the world. We began working in Latin America after that, working with street children there. And I see I'm nearly out of time, so I'll finish with this story this morning, because for me, this story taught me more about God's love more than any other. I was there in Colombia, in the city of Medellin, and I was working there with a priest, an amazing priest who was working with children on the streets. It's a very violent city, thousands of children living on the streets there, many of them being murdered. And this priest had a group who every morning would go out on the streets looking for these children. And we were there because we were trying to help this group build a home, the first children's home for some of these kids. So anyway, we would go out early in the mornings and we would look for children on the streets, and we would offer them a hot breakfast, and we would begin talking to them to understand their lives a little bit better, and to invite them back to a day centre. And so this particular morning we found this little boy. He was maybe 6 years old, sleeping under some cardboard on the side of the street, and we woke him up and we gave him his breakfast, and he gobbled down his hot breakfast. And then we began talking to him, and there was a journalist with me from Scotland. She was there to write an article about the lives of these children, and she said to the little boy, who's your best friend? She was just trying to start to build a picture of the boy's life. And she said, who's your best friend? And he looked up immediately and he said, God is my best friend. And we were all very taken aback. We knew that little boy had seen some of his friends murdered on the street. We knew he didn't have parents who were teaching him. We knew he'd never benefited from any catechism or anything like that. And she said to him, I think the journalist said the question that was in all our minds, why do you say that? And he said, because God gives me everything I need. You know, and that little boy didn't know where his next meal was coming from. He'd seen all those horrific things in his life. He had every reason not to trust in the mercy of God. And yet he did. You know, and those words spoken with such conviction that day really evangelized me and all of us who are trying to serve that little boy. You know, he served us much more. And often as the years go by and we're doing this work, and so much of this work of Mary's Meals does involve trusting in God. You know, when we're deciding, do we have the funds to expand into one of those new schools? Because so many schools around the world are waiting for us to be able to say that we can begin serving them. So lots of hard choices, and lots of it tests our trust in God's providence, trust that He'll never let us down. And often when I'm being challenged like that, I think about that little boy, you know, and his real trust in God, in a God that would never ever let him down, a God that loves him so much every moment. So I thank God for that experience and so many experiences doing this work of Mary's Meals. For me, you know, the sense of surprise at being called to do this work never goes away. I'm not qualified to do this work in any sense. When I was a young man, I was so shy, I never would have ever put my hand up in school in class and said anything. I went to university and I lasted 6 months because I was so shy I couldn't adapt from the village I grew up in to the university in the town. It wasn't even a big town. And here I am, that God's got me doing this with my life, traveling around the world talking about this beautiful work of His, this work that I feel like this gift He's given us in Mary's Meals is a gift that we just continue to unwrap every day and find out that it's even more beautiful than we first thought. So tomorrow I'm speaking again, and I'll tell you a little bit more tomorrow about how the next part of the mission unfolded, how that worked, and how that's changing, you know, so many thousands, well, over millions of lives today around the world. But I thank you for listening this morning, and more than anything, I want to thank those of you who are already supporting this mission in so many beautiful ways. Please keep doing that. Please, those of you who might be new to the mission of Mary's Meals, please come and see us at our stand next door so we can tell you more about it. If any of you are enjoying the stories about Mary's Meals, I wrote a book that's really just about all these beautiful stories, many more stories than the one I told this morning. So if any of you would like that, I'll be at the stand during the lunch break and happy to sign some of those. Thank you very much for listening. God bless.
Fantastic. Magnus, well done. Fantastic.